Alright folks, we're back for part 2 of this 3-part video series, Splicing Stasis. For today's build, we're going to use some of the aspects and fragments that were introduced in the Season of the Splicer to make a build for the Shadebinder. Let's get started. The Shadebinder's newest aspect is Glacial Harvest. It causes freezing targets to spawn stasis shards around them. These shards can be collected to reduce the cooldown of your melee. Higher tier enemies create more shards, with minors creating 1, majors 2, and bosses 3. This aspect, in tandem with the newly added Whisper of Hunger fragment, is an incredibly potent combination. Hunger increases the melee energy gained from picking up shards, and it takes a total of 6 shards to fully restore your melee. Now, I don't want to spend unnecessary time playing Pac-Man while enemies are shooting at me, and thankfully there's another fragment that will help me with this. Whisper of Conduction causes nearby stasis shards to track to your position. The tracking does not have infinite range, but it's long enough that you won't need to go far out of your way to eat up. Next, we're going to turn our attention to mods. The setup is very similar to what I was using in my Bleak Watcher build. For mods, I'll be using 4 Firepower mods and 1 Charge Harvester. Firepower refunds a portion of your grenade cooldown when you throw it while charged with light, and Charge Harvester causes kills or assists of any kind to have a chance to charge you with light. The reason I'm focusing so heavily on grenade uptime is because our grenades are significantly better at freezing than our melee. A single well-placed cold snap will freeze enough enemies to fully recharge our melee, and things start to get really nutty when you add in the second aspect, Ice Flare Bolts. Shattered enemies spawn additional Seekers that will freeze enemies they hit. For the final 2 fragment slots, I'll be using Whisper of Fissures for increased shatter damage and radius, and Whisper of Refraction. Killing slowed or frozen targets refunds class ability energy. The reason for that is the Bomber on my class item. It causes activating your class ability to reduce the cooldown of your grenade. So, this build, like most of our builds, has a lot of stuff going on, but don't worry, I'm not here to rattle off a bunch of names and abilities. I'm also here to show you how they work in the field. So let's get out there and start testing. Alright folks, it's time for us to get into the testing for today's build video. We are inside the K1 Communion Lost Sector because we're going to start things off nice and easy so I can explain the different mechanics without getting destroyed. You guys know how this works by now. But before we go in, a note that I want to make is that my weapon has Demolitionist on it. I'm trying to feed as much cooldown reduction into my grenades as I can physically squeeze into my build, because my grenades function as a catalyst for my melee. Because every time I freeze something, which I'll be doing with my grenades, it's providing me with those stasis shards, and I collect those for the cooldown reduction on my melee. And that is going to be reinforced even further by my stat distribution in my armor. I have tier 10 discipline, so my grenade cooldown is 53 seconds, which is pretty short. And it's reduced a little bit further by the Eye of Another World exotic helmet. So at base level, my grenade cooldown is very short, and then all these other factors are coming and cutting it down even farther. So it gets a little bit silly, the amount of grenades I throw. But you'll notice my melee cooldown is 1 minute and 35 seconds, which is pretty hefty because I only have tier 3 strength, but that's not going to matter because of all these stasis shards that I'm going to be creating. Now, the first thing that I find to be very important for this setup is to always start off battles by using your melee, because you don't want to have any wasted stasis shards. You want to get every little bit of cooldown reduction you can. But once that melee has been sent out, you throw out the grenades and you start freezing as many targets as you can, and look at that, my melee is ready again. So we send it out and we start destroying enemies, and more shards will track to our position. Now, Glacial Harvest does have a limit on how many shards can be spawned in succession, and once it comes up, it has a cooldown. But the cooldown is short enough that you don't have to worry too much about it, and we're already seeing coming into play, freezing the major enemy spawned 2 shards at its location, and the minor spawned 1 shard. So that's going to be our basic loop, is we send out our melee, and we collect our shards. And then we try to save our grenade for when we're charged with light so that we can get that big bit of refund when we throw it out. The 4 firepower mods are giving me a massive return on investment. And then those demolitionist kills are helping to top me off. I get another grenade immediately, send it out, and start the loop again. I've got Bomber on the class item. I activate my class ability to get more cooldown reduction. It is a very self-sufficient system, and I absolutely love it. It is comparable to the Bleak Watcher setup, the only difference being the control you exert over the battlefield isn't as long-lasting. The Bleak Watcher turrets, they stay active for about 35 seconds. And in a lot of the easier content in the game, that feels like too long, and sometimes the Bleak Watcher can feel a little bit slow because of that. But when you crank the difficulty up to master and you're finding yourself gunning enemies down for sometimes 10 seconds at a time, having a turret sitting around to help you control the battlefield feels really nice. But in the lower difficulties, you just want to throw out a grenade and freeze some fools. You know, I don't need to worry. I don't need a Bleak Watcher to deal with these guys. I just need them to turn to ice so I can blast them in the face. Same for these guys coming up. I don't need a turret for that. I can just freeze them and shoot them in the face. Now, am I saying this setup doesn't have viability in higher difficulties? Absolutely not. It's incredibly strong there too, but it's a little bit more bursty, and it's geared more towards freeze them, pop them, freeze them, and pop them over and over and over again, while the Bleak Watcher is about controlling the battlefield for a long period of time. Look at that. A single grenade generating a bunch of shards for me. Now, I did have my melee on cooldown there, so I wasn't able to benefit from picking up those little shards, but that's okay. So that's pretty much the gist of it. Always try to keep your melee off cooldown so that whenever you freeze something and pick up a shard, you're getting a benefit from it. Like right there, get that big chunk of cooldown reduction. We'll pop those guys, we'll send out the melee and miss because we're bad, but hey, we picked up a little shard, so we got the cooldown reduction. So all is right with the universe in the end. Now, as for the distance of the tracking, it's decent. It's pretty much within the range of the melee itself, so you're not going to have to worry too much about, you know, leaving a good position to go pick up a shard, because they'll find their way to you at some point. You know, so let's say there's a big old heavy shank and a bunch of enemies around there. You send out the freeze, then you hide. You just wait for them things to come forward. You don't have to worry about trying to run in and collect them for the cooldown reduction, which is something that I absolutely love. Possibly my favorite thing about the melee is it will occasionally react with ice flare bolts and feed into itself. So if I freeze this guy, it'll generate the 3 shards, and as soon as he shatters, he's going to get refrozen by the ice flare bolts, and I'm going to get a full melee reset just from hitting one boss enemy with the melee ability, and that's pretty freaking awesome. The damage isn't incredible from that because the shatter damage and the melee damage are not substantial enough to really hurt a boss, but it's still something cool that you can do. And then if you pair that with the freezing from your grenades and your bombers and all that stuff, then you're really putting a lot of control on the battlefield even when a boss is out, which on a few occasions it can be necessary. Now for the next bit, we're going to head into the Scavenger's Den, Legendary Lost Sectors. So this is cranking up the difficulty. We're going to have to play a bit more seriously, but our build, of course, is strong enough to deal with it. Now, this Lost Sector has a good mixture of long-range and close-range encounters, so we're going to have to play against that. But we're going to start things off by engaging with our rotation. We use that melee first, and that gave us the stasis shards. So now, when I do throw my grenade out, when I find a good opportunity to do so, it is going to freeze some enemies and then give me even more cooldown reduction. I was a little scared of that guy, so I sent out the grenade. Maybe didn't need to, but the ice flare bolts, they got me covered. It feels like it was worth it in the end. Now my melee is back and ready again, and look at that, we froze the barrier servitor, but we're getting sniped from across the way, so I got to be careful about how I approach this. Yeah, that guy's not fun over there. I haven't done this Lost Sector in a while, so I don't have the perfect strategy for it, so I'm going to have to be a little bit careful. I'm going to try and find a position that allows me to avoid the sniper while also dealing with the barrier servitor. So we're going to come down a little bit. The barrier servitor is now frozen, so I can deal with all his cronies, so they're not being annoying. Let's just refreeze him because I think he still has one more crony over there. Yes, he does. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this Deathbringer above his head. And the rockets are going to come down. He's going to take a bunch of damage. And then we're going to pop his shield. And then And then we finish. Now, it certainly wasn't the fastest way that could have been done, but it is a way that could have been done. So now we've got a bunch of enemies with the high ground, and if anybody here has watched Star Wars, you know that's a problem. And there's also an overload champion. If I shatter this guy, the Ice Flare Bolt is not going to reach the champion. Maybe that one will. Yes, it did. So now we can get the overload pretty easily. Shoot up, reload. Shoot up, reload again. And it was enough. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Alright, let's make sure we have ammo for the next encounter. This is a pretty fun Lost Sector. I haven't done it for such a long time. Alright, let's keep it moving. So now I'm going to try and stick to my rotation. Unfortunately, I missed my melee there, so that is very unfortunate. But we have our grenade ready again, so if I place it well, we'll get a really big freeze and create a bunch of shards for ourselves. But there is a barrier servitor around here somewhere, and I guess there's enemies up here on the high ground, so let's just create a bunch of stasis shards for ourselves. Get the sniper. And get things ready. So whenever I approach a champion, I try to have abilities ready to deal with them, because they are easier to deal with if you can control them, especially when it's a barrier servitor shielding a bunch of boys. Alright, and I actually think that's an overload champion up there, so maybe this is not going to be as difficult as I thought it was. And I threw my grenade in the stairs and it went all stupid. That's fine. We got another one back. So, you know, having a high cooldown reduction is not just good for, you know, being more effective. It's also good for cleaning up your mistakes. So I'm just going to freeze him because I don't want him teleporting around all crazy when I'm trying to do this. And then we switch back. He's already dead, but I was ready for another overload just in case he survived. Now we've still got plenty of ammo left in our heavy weapon, but we are approaching the end here, and this part does get very difficult. I do remember this part being somewhat problematic because of the volume of enemies, but we should be able to do some nice things. So we'll send out that melee first. Of course, we'll get our shards back. Now, there's a barrier champion protecting an overload captain who is aggressively pushing forward, and I don't like that. I don't like any of this. I'm just going to use my super here because I want to combo the barrier servitor because he's causing me too many problems. So, now that that threat's been eliminated, I'm just going to try and freeze the captain. That's what I wanted to do. So now we overload him. And do the same thing that we've been doing. Oh, he cheated. You all saw it. You heard the sound. He cheated. Okay, well, I was probably gonna die there anyway because I was taking shots from the back, but I think you get the point of what I was trying to do. But freeze him, stun him, and we do this thing again. And basically, as soon as he's waking up, is when the second volley comes in. I was a little bit slow on that one. I shot the second shot way too far above his head, and I'm getting trolled now. They're just laughing at me. But this was a pretty good showcase of the build, especially in an environment that I'm a little bit unfamiliar with because, you know, I was fumbling around going in different places, not really sure exactly where everything was and what every enemy type that I was going to encounter was. So that did feel like a solid showcase of how the build can work. So with that said, we are going to wrap things up here. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more Stasis builds, there are plenty more on the channel already, and there's one more coming in the near future for the Hunter, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron.